And now an ancient word in Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 through 15. There will be 3 parts to this narrative reading. You will read the bold text as the Israelites. Jonathan will read the part of Moses. I will read as the narrator, and another voice will speak as God. The covenant people leave the pleasant coastal area around Elim to begin the long journey through the wilderness. It will take longer than anyone expects, and today we hear about their experience. The whole Israelite community complained against Moses and Aaron in the desert. The Israelites said to them,
"Eat our fill of bread. Instead, you've brought us out into this desert."
Then the Lord said to Moses,
I'm going to make bread rain down from the sky for you. The people will go out each day and gather just enough for that day. In this way, I'll test them to see whether or not they follow my instruction. On the 6th day, when they measure out what they have collected, it will be twice as much as they collected on other days.
So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites,
"This evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the Lord's glorious presence, because your complaints against the Lord have been heard. Who are we? Why blame us? The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening, and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord heard the complaints you made against him. Who are we? Your complaints aren't against us, but against the Lord."
Then Moses said to Aaron,
"Say to the whole Israelite community, 'Come near to the Lord, because he's heard your complaints.'"
As Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned to look toward the desert. And just then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses.
I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God.
In the evening, a flock of quail flew down and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew all around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the desert surface were thin flakes, as thin as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other,
"What is it?"
They didn't know what it was. Moses said to them,
"This is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat."
Holy wisdom, holy words. Thanks be to God. So this season is a long season. It started the Sunday after Pentecost, and it goes, this part of the season, we're gonna end on Labor Day weekend. And then we'll do some more. But the whole season actually goes from the Sunday after Pentecost until the Sunday before Advent, which isn't until Advent starts December 1 this year. This part of the season, though, we're looking at what does it mean to be Christian. And like I've said, that might sound like a silly thing to look at, because it's pretty obvious if you're Christian, if you follow Jesus Christ. Well, that's true, but there's also a lot of different ways to follow Jesus. And even though we're all reading the same text, it really matters which verses you emphasize and think are the most important verses. So we end up living it out differently, so that everybody that calls themselves Christian doesn't live and act the way I do. And so we're wrestling with that. What is true for you? What fits you and who you are as a Christian? And with that being said, because we do focus on Jesus, we use both the Hebrew or the Old Testament and the New Testament. And today's story, I say that because today's story is out of the Hebrew Testament. That was the Testament, those were the scriptures that Jesus had and that Jesus quoted from. So it's important to know those stories too. So today we're going to be looking at a story out of Exodus. And we're going to be listening to how the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. But I want to say that we too have done some wandering. And I'm not sure if our vision is clear yet. We've been talking, actually, for as long as I've been with this congregation, we've been talking about what is our clear vision for the future? Who is God really calling us to be in this time and in this place? And we've batted a few things around, and nothing's completely stuck yet. But I have to name that this wandering that we're doing is difficult. And bluntly, clarity sells. If we were more clear, this is how a lot of the fundamental churches are growing, because they're very clear in what they believe. This is exactly what God wants us to do, and if we just do this, we're good. I think it's bigger than that. And I also think what came to me this morning as I was thinking about this was, we've been talking about God wanting us to do something. And maybe that isn't the point. Maybe it's not about what we need to do, but about who we need to be. That keeps coming to me, that it matters who we are. And maybe that's even more important than what we do, except to live out who we are. At any rate, I want to name for you that we know what this wandering is about. And nobody likes to wander for very long. We like assurances. We like clarity. We like answers. We like to know this is it. And we're moving forward. That's how we're programmed. And that's definitely how our society is programmed. So I want to just name that and thank you for being with me in this kind of wilderness where we're wrestling through all of it. So if we go back to our story, we've got these Israelites. Here's the short version to bring us up to speed on the story, right? The Israelites were in Egypt. They were slaves under the Pharaoh. Life was not good. They were working very hard. They had a lot. It was hard work. They didn't have a lot of rest. They needed help. And God finally raised up a leader for them in Moses. And Moses said, "Follow me." And Moses, with God's help, gets them out of Egypt and into the wilderness, and they're on their way to the promised land. God has told them that he will take them to the promised land, the land of milk and honey. But it's not really clear how to get there. It's not really clear how long it will take to get there. We know the whole story, so it took them 40 years. Again, remember, they don't have our calendar, so 40 years was a very long time, probably more than a generation lived through that. And so the story that's right before the reading that we did, they're out there and they're thirsty. And they're like, "Hey, wait a minute, we need some water." And God takes them to an oasis, but the water's bitter. Like, why did God bring us to water when we can't drink it? But God tells Moses to throw this piece of wood in the water, and then the water's fine. Isn't that an interesting piece? It's about learning to trust God. When we look at the bigger picture of this, they had to learn to trust God. They couldn't rely on their own resources anymore. And that's a piece of wandering in the wilderness that we can all learn. There's a lot of good that happens in the wilderness, even though we don't like it. It causes us to question our priorities. It makes us think about what are the needs versus the wants of our life. I'm sure that most of us could hardly imagine picking up what we had, what we could carry on our backs and leaving home for a walk to you're not really sure where, or you're not really sure how far. But you're going to walk until God tells you that you are where you belong. Think of how desperate you would have to be to make that kind of a decision. I also want to name that we are privileged. And I know that saying that we are privileged is a politically loaded word right now. But if you have a toilet that flushes, if you have water, running water that you can turn on in your house, and you have a floor that's not dirt, you are doing better than most of the people in the world. This happens to be from Honduras. I got a Honduras crowd in the front here, so I pulled a picture. It was not one of my pictures, but it was a Honduras picture, and I saw plenty of houses that looked like that. Actually, they usually have tarps instead of the clay, right? We don't live in houses like that. It was so shocking to me this past weekend at Vacation Bible School, because I was talking about water. We had some stories about where to get water. And so I would ask the kids, if you're thirsty, where do you get water? At the refrigerator. I think every one of those kids had a refrigerator, the kind with the water on the outside. They're like, you just put the glass at the refrigerator. And I'm like, do you know that the majority of people in the world don't have a refrigerator with a place to put the glass, and water just automatically comes out of it? And by the way, if there's not a pipe that's going to your refrigerator, there's not going to be any water that comes out of it. Like, helping them think that through. You know, it's kind of like the kids that think that our food only comes from a grocery store. We have to make sure that they understand how we connect to the land, how we connect to our food sources. Sorry, that was a side tangent. So the people were frustrated. But in the scripture that we read, God hears that. God doesn't look at them and say, oh, they're at it again, right? I put up that cartoon earlier because I thought I had a hard time finding a picture that looked anything like what I wanted to put up. So I thought, well, we'll make it a lighter moment, right? But God heard their grumblings, and it wasn't one of those, oh, they're at it again. It was, God had compassion for the people. He understood that they didn't have what they needed. He understood that they were really hungry. Now that's the other piece that we have to name. That if they're hungry at this point, that's because they've already eaten everything that they brought. Because the reality of that time is, if they were going on a trip like that, in their bag of things that they took some food. But now that's gone too. And there isn't a McDonald's or a Sheetz or a Wawa on every corner. So they really are hungry. So God promises them that in the morning when they wake up, there will be this white flaky substance on the ground that they can eat or make bread with. And that at night, the quail, if you see those things, they kind of look like ghosts. It's not my favorite impression of this scene, but it was a nice big one that was kind of clear. Those ghosty things are the quail coming down at night. That every night they will have meat, and every morning they will have bread for the day. And I have to wonder if they didn't have to get to a certain point, get to a certain level of desperation to be able to look at that white stuff on the ground and say, oh, thank God instead of, you want me to eat what? You know, if white flaky stuff just showed up on our ground in the morning, I don't think any of us would be thankful right now. We'd be like, what the heck happened overnight? What is this and why is it here? But they were stuck when they first left, and even in this scripture that we just read, they were stuck thinking about the bread and the stew pots of meat that they had been sitting at. Life was good in that way. Isn't it interesting how our memories can just gloss over all the sharp edges of our stories and our experiences? Sometimes not all the edges, but all of a sudden they forgot that they were slaves. They forgot how hard they worked. And they were just focused on the fact that they used to have plenty to eat. Eating was easy when they were in Egypt. And they were willing to give up their freedom that they had just gained to go for food. Can you imagine being at that point? Are you that scared that you're willing to give up your freedoms to go back to something else? I sat with that and I reflected on that because there's a lot of fear going on in the world. And I know that a lot of it has to do with change. We don't like change. Let's just name it. Nobody likes it. We like routines. We want security and safety and stability. We want to know that when we get up in the morning, we can have our cup of coffee, we can do whatever, read the paper or do whatever our routine is. We want to know that that's going to happen every time. There's security and we like routines. Even with children, that's one of the big things that they say in parenting is give them a structure. Kids flourish in structure, and so do we. But every now and then, we have to break that structure because that structure limits us. It limits what we can do. It limits who we are. It limits how we relate to God. If we put a structure around God, if we limit God and put God in a box, then God can't be God. And we can't be who God's really created us to be if we limit ourselves. It's about opening it up. I know change is coming at us fast right now. But then I stop and I think about my grandparents who died when they were 95. They lived the 20th century. And the change that they went from the beginning, from how they grew up, how they were raised before the Depression and through the Depression till into the 2000s. It's mind-blowing. And I cannot imagine what life is going to be like in another 20 years. And I will probably be struggling to keep up with it. But that's part of life. So we come together and we support one another through it. Because life gives us what life gives us. Some things we control, some things we can't. I was like, I can't do this with a band and not use the band. So I came in this morning and said, oh, by the way, do you know this refrain? And they're like, No, but we can pull it up. I'm like, perfect. Pull it up. Because you can't always get what you want, right? That's a reality. But we can get what we need. God will supply what we need. And remember what the kids told, a little child shall lead. The kids told us what we need. The very first answer was we need God. We need God. We need water and food, and we need friends and love. That's what life is supposed to be about. All the rest is icing on the cake. It's about having what we need, and God will supply what we need. If we're watching, are we paying attention to what God's doing? Are we listening to the Spirit? That's on us. Because it can all be going on, and if we're ignoring it, we're missing the whole show. So opening ourselves up to what God is doing, and then being grateful. Grateful for every day, for every moment that we have together. Every sunshine, every sunrise, every rainy day. Grateful for the storms as well as the sun, because we need it all. Grateful for the weeds. I'm pulling plenty of weeds right now, but I got to remember to be grateful for them too. Somebody told me a long time ago, a weed is just a flower out of place. That's a whole different way to look at a weed, right? Look at what God gives to us. God set up this system where we can live. Thanks be to God. Amen.